Hello, everyone. Alrighty, so we are finally here. Let's talk about chatbots. So before we jump straight in, I'd like to say I hope everyone's sentiment analysis is going well. If it's not, just swing by one of the office hours that I have up, and I will help you work through it. Turns out the screen sharing properties of the Zoom chats works extremely well for me to be able to help you with your code. So that said, let's go into a nice introduction for chatbot. So first off, we probably need to define what is a chatbot. Well, a chatbot is just a text-based entity that you can interact with on typically a website of some sort of online platform, typically. So something that you will type an input to, and then it will respond with its output. And that may or may not make sense. The interesting thing is they serve as a very nice uh, first line for customer service and are predicted to be used by up to around approximately 80% of companies within the next year or so. So they are extremely cost effective, very useful, and a lot of companies want people that can work with them. So that's why we're covering them today. It's also a nice little segue from sentiment analysis into chatbots, since almost, I would say, 80%, 90% of the code is the same. So once you learn one, it's a lot easier to learn the other. So chatbots, which we're going to look at a few examples today, can be broken down into two main categories. So, two main categories, and the categories are, the first one is going to be retrieval based. So, I'm going to write this carefully so people can read it. Retrieval based. And then the second one is generative. Generative. Okay. So those are the two main categories of chatbots. And we'll start off talking about the retrieval base because they are by far the easiest of the chatbots to implement. So let me clear the screen. And let's see. So retrieval based models, they use a database. So retrieval based, they use a database. And the database has two components. So the first component of the database is the set of inputs. So a retrieval-based chatbot will take a user's input and attempt to match it versus its set of inputs that it has inside of its database. Okay. Then if it finds a match, it outputs one of the set of outputs. So you have the user's input. So the user is going to send in some text, and it will then check that text versus all the entries inside of its database, and it will find one that it matches the closest, and then it will output to the user the output. This is the outputs that correspond to that input. So for example, if you're a retrieval-based chatbot, and inside of the input database, I can put the label on top of that, inputs. Let's say that I had an entry for um, the price of pizza. If the user inputs some text that says, what is the price of pizza? It would match that inside of its input database, and then it would output the entry that corresponded with that input. So it might output $8.99 for a large. So all that a retrieval-based chatbot is doing is matching the user's text to its set of inputs in its database, and then outputting the corresponding entry for the input that it matched with. Okay? So that's it. It is very simple to implement. How robust it is depends on how large you want to build your database. If you want to handle, uh, let's say that you are an insurance company and you want to be able to handle people asking about all the different kinds of insurance, the prices that they'd charge for each one of them, how long you would have to own the policies before certain payouts occurred, etc. All these different questions, if you wanted to handle them, every single one of them has to be listed inside the inputs of the database. And each one of them will then have an output that the chatbot will give to the user since it matches one of the inputs. Now, this is it's not only the easiest chatbot to implement, it's also going to be the one that is by far the most common, because all it does is it matches user inputs to its inputs and then gives an output. So this allows the companies or whoever is implementing the chatbots, to have predetermined outputs that are grammatically correct, that are they have exactly the bit of information but nothing more. They are easy to control. Now, let's contrast that with a generative model. So let me clear this screen. I have the hardest time clearing the screen. I don't know why. Let's see. Okay, so now let's talk about the generative models. So the generative models train on a massive amount of data. So these are giant chat logs or databases that have been developed from the chat logs, things like that. When I say massive, we're talking millions of entries. This is what you would typically think of when you think of an artificial intelligence, something that would learn how to have a conversation based on the conversations that it's trained with. So this is the model that most people think of when they think of a chatbot. It's something that is semi-intelligent, kind of hiding in the background, and it's understanding what they type in and then giving them what they want as an output. That's not exactly true, because it's only as good as the data it trains off, and there's still a lot of problems with generative models. Syntax is very difficult for them to get. For example, in a generative model, you could say, how old are you? And whatever its output is, who knows? Maybe it's 72. No idea. But you want the exact same answer to happen if you say, how long have you been alive? And a good model would have to be able to recognize that both of these questions are pretty much the same thing. You want it to output 72, but if it doesn't see that these things are pretty much identical, it may not. So that's just one reason why generative models are difficult. The other is there are many different ways you can phrase questions, and not all of them are obvious what they're asking. I will say English is particularly difficult to parse to where it makes sense. And it has to understand what the input is in order to be able to check its model and find something that would make sense for you as an output. So the way that its kind of schematic would be drawn is that it's got the user input. So the user is going to give some sort of query or statement to it. And then rather than having lines in a database, it takes and translates what the user input is, runs it through its model, and the model again is it is a large, complicated model that's been trained on massive amounts of data. So we're talking neural networks, things like that. So once it runs it through its model, it then generates the output. And the output did not come from a database. It generates it from scratch based on the model. Having a conversational, generative chatbot is one of the holy grails of machine learning, uh, or artificial intelligence in general, I should say. Um, but it is extremely difficult to do right. There are, I would not know the actual numbers, but far more chatbots are retrieval based than there are generative. And you know instantly which one you're dealing with based on how it responds to a question. And we're going to look at a few examples of each at the end of the video. But these, going over the retrieval based and the generative models, now you at least have an idea of the two types of chatbots and how they're kind of set up. Now that we've kind of done the broad strokes, let's kind of dive into some of the specifics of what they're good at and what they're terrible at. So let's do that. Let me clear the screen. So, okay, so let's talk about retrieval-based models, chatbots. So here we go. So the advantages, and by the way, apologies if you hear dogs barking in the background. That's just part of living on a small farm. So hopefully they're not too distracting. Um, so what are some of the advantages of retrieval based? So the advantages. Well, the big advantage is there are no mistakes in its output. So no output mistakes. What do I mean by that? Well, there are no errors in grammar. So perfect grammar, perfect formatting, and perfect scope. When someone asks for a quote on some insurance, um, you know exactly how much information you need to send out. So it will send out that information and nothing more. So um, retrieval-based chatbots are preferred due to they will always give the user exactly what's needed, nothing else. Okay. Um, the other huge advantage is that they are simple. Once you have the retrieval-based chatbot code implemented, you can change the input data part of the database and the output part of the database at any point, and it will completely change how the chatbot functions. You can set it up to be as elaborate and as thorough as you want to. It's completely up to you how detailed you want to make your databases. Okay, so those are the two main advantages for retrieval based. And the disadvantages, well, You can probably already guess some of them. Number one, they can't handle unexpected input. Uh, they take the user's input. Let me just spell this out, otherwise I'm going to misspell unexpected. I'm a horrible speller. So they take the user's input and then try to match it to their input database. If the input is something that hasn't been anticipated, it has no idea what to output, which is why typically you will default to a very neutral statement if it doesn't understand the input, like, I didn't understand that. Can you try rephrasing or something like that? So any kind of unexpected input, it falls apart. It can't handle it. Um, Now, the other disadvantage, and this isn't a huge disadvantage, but it is something, is that it can't do conversations. If you try to do any kind of conversation with retrieval-based chatbots, it will quickly run through its inputs that are in the input part of its database, and then you'll be back to having no idea how to handle what the user just input. Um, so retrieval-based chatbots are good at short, direct responses, responses that have a well-defined scope, that are not open-ended whatsoever. The user asks a question or does some sort of input they need clarification on, and the chatbot outputs exactly what that pertains to. So retrieval-based chatbots are really, really good for companies because you typically, if you're running a company that has a chatbot, you have a number of items you want the chatbot to be able to talk about, but you don't care about if the person asks the chatbot, how is the weather today? Or what is the meaning of life? All of that you could care less about, so you just have to default to an I didn't understand that. So retrieval based are king right now for chatbots. It's going to be, I think, a long time before we get generative chatbots used by companies. So that was the retrieval based. Now let's look at the generative, and you can probably already guess how this is going to go. So let me clear the screen. So for the generative, well, the advantages, which you can probably already guess since they're going to be the exact opposite, advantages, well, they can respond with a conversation. And with a conversation. So generative chatbots are friendly. You can ask them how they're doing. They'll tell you. You can ask them what the weather is like. You can thank them. You can say, thank you for answering my question. And it won't just be a response that someone typed in. It will be organic. Well, thank you. I'm happy I helped you. Things like that. So generative chatbots are friendly. They seem like you're talking to an actual person, and uh, studies have shown by a very large margin, think 87% to 13%, that people do not want to talk to computers when they are chatting. They want to talk to a person. So what people want is exactly what a generative chatbot can do. It can hold a conversation. Um, Now that is leads to its second huge advantage is um, it can handle any inputs. Can handle any inputs. The user might suddenly ask it, what is the most common color for a car? It will look in its database, its model. I shouldn't say database, but in its model, I guess you could call it a database in a way. It will look for its model and try to translate what the user just put into something that it can talk about, some sort of output that makes sense. It will fail miserably for a lot of them, but let's say you had a generative model for astronomy questions. You could ask a very wide range of astronomy questions to the chatbot, and it would be able to answer most of them in a way that made you feel like you were talking to an actual person. Why is um, the sun yellow? Well, it could look through its trained model and come up with something that sounded organic. The sun is yellow because blah blah blah, and it would give a response. So uh, this being able to handle any input means you don't have to be as narrow with your range of questions that it can handle. It will try to handle anything. It may not make sense, its output, but it's going to attempt it. And so both of these advantages done together are the reason why generative models are being heavily researched. Because the second that they're able to respond with a conversation and handle any user input, they suddenly will become the dominant chatbot. There's no question. But we have a long way to get there because of some of the disadvantages. So the disadvantages, and I'm sure you can already guess what they're going to be, some of them. They tend to not respond in a way that makes sense very often. So their responses don't typically make sense very often. When I say very often, I mean don't make sense. Let me write that down or I'll forget it. Very often. So you can talk to a chatbot, a generative chatbot, for a few sentences and everything will look like it's going fine. But the second you say something that doesn't have something it's been trained on inside of its model, it will output a response that is odd. It may be sort of right, but it's missing the meaning. So that is a huge, huge problem for businesses. You don't want the customer to ask how much an insurance quote is, and the bot says, "It's nice if you wear a tie with that." That has it comes completely out of left field and makes the user upset because they instantly know that they're chatting with a computer program, and it's just frustrating if it doesn't understand what you're trying to say. So generative models aren't used by businesses for that reason. And the other reason, the huge disadvantage that they're not used, is that they are extremely complicated. These are not systems that are usually something a person could implement themselves. Entire companies have divisions that work on generative chatbots. This is not a problem that can be solved easily. You need tons of data. You need models that are robust at figuring out the inputs semantically. They have to understand the nuance of what the person is trying to say. They have to understand sarcasm, and you can just go on and on about what they need to be able to understand in order to respond appropriately. Doesn't happen. So right now, the state of the art chatbots are still unable to carry on conversations well enough to make you think you're talking to a human. You may think that for half a dozen interactions, but it is going to break, even the very best ones that are out there right now. So next thing we're going to do is to actually look at some examples of each of them, and that way I think you can get a better sense of what they really are, how they actually operate. So let me clear the screen and we will look at an example. Okay, so here we are with Dom, the Domino's Pizza chatbot that helps you with your orders. So unfortunately, you can't see the entire website because it's a little bit large, but I will be typing out off screen messages to it and we'll see how it responds. So let's say, what are the specials tonight? And I don't know if you can see that, but uh, it responded. To show you coupon options, I'll need to get your location. Are you interested in, and then it says delivery or carryout. You know what? I'm going to slide the screen over. You don't need to look at his little face over there. I can, uh, let me slide this over. Okay, so I've moved the screen down where you can actually see. So, interested in delivery or carryout? I am interested in carryout. Okay, it's thinking. And it asks me if I want to log in with a pizza profile, or to create one, or to continue as a guest, rather. So I want to be a guest. Okay, so now it says it needs phone number. So each of its responses are outputting because my input matched something in its input database. If I do something completely off script and ask something unusual, like what do apples weigh? It has no idea what I'm talking about, so it just gives me a generic screen to start the conversation back in a place where it can start from and knows where it's on familiar ground. So this is a beautiful example of a retrieval-based chatbot that's done correctly. Um, as long as I keep the conversation about pizza, it's going to be able to guide me through the whole process of ordering the pizza. But the second I go off script, it has no idea what to do, so it just gives me this little kind of intro set of options to try to steer the conversation back to something it knows about. So that is a perfect example of why chatbots are being implemented by companies everywhere. 80% of companies. That's a ridiculous amount of companies because they are very, very good at handling simple customer needs. Um, and the second that the customer goes off script and says something that it doesn't understand, it could do this, where it kind of resets everything with an original menu set of choices, or it can hand off the conversation to an actual representative who is standing by, waiting to chat with you. So you go from a chatbot to a human seamlessly behind the scenes as soon as you start to ask something that the chatbot doesn't understand. So those are two of the best ways to handle interacting with the customers. You're not going to see a generative one, because if it had been a generative um, chatbot and I'd asked it, what do apples weigh? It would have responded with something trying to answer the question. Probably something that made no sense, but it would have tried. So that is a great example of the retrieval based. Now let's look at a couple of the generative. So let's see, let me come up here, stop this, and now we'll be right back. Okay, so now let's look at one of the generative chatbots, and this is Cleverbot. And it has been trained on user conversation. And if you look carefully, down at the bottom it says, please note Cleverbot learns from people. Things it says may seem inappropriate. Use with discretion and at your own risk. And so its model has been trained on what people have said. So um, if the people said things that were inappropriate, it learned that inappropriate response. And just as a side note, opening it up to the web is just asking for people to mess with the responses to make it as inappropriate as they can possibly do. So we're going to try to keep the conversation steered to areas that make sense. I've already been chatting with it a little bit, so let's see something like what is 10 times 4 a number? Oh, it didn't even have the response, what it was. Okay, what is 3 squared? Don't know. It hasn't been trained on that. Alrighty. Now let's go with how much do apples weigh? That is personal. So it had no idea what to say, so it throws out, that is personal. That's funny. Um, let's see. Who won the first World Series? Okay. I think that should have been First World War, but it matched World Series with its entry, I should have, when it translated the World Series query, it was close enough to the World War that it output something that's corresponding to the World War. That is fascinating. Um, but you can you can go down a rabbit hole with these chatbots very quickly. I highly recommend that you try Cleverbot or the one we're going to be looking at, AliceBot, just at least once. Make that kind of like your unofficial homework to try them out because they are so much fun to interact with, and you can kind of get an idea of why they're still not there. They can handle a lot of inputs, but as soon as the inputs are different from what they've been trained with, they're lost. They output things that make no sense. What language do butterflies speak? Beautiful. English, Argentinian, partly French, and partly German. That is so good. Makes no sense, but it's fun to do. So go play with Cleverbot. Let me now show you AliceBot. So I'm going to stop this. Okay, so this is AliceBot that I've been talking with for a little bit. Um, you can see some of the responses made a lot of sense. Are you human? No, I'm not. I am a robot. Would you like to be human? No, I'm content with my robot existence. Is it dark where you are? Maybe. Ask Allison if it is. Allison, is it dark where you are? You shouldn't spread gossip like that. Right there, it goes off the rails. It can't quite understand what I meant by what I typed in. So if I do standard questions, it's totally fine, as you saw with the are you human? So, who made you? Let's see if that response is in there. There you go. So, um, who is that? Let's see if it can understand that. Yep. See, what does that refer to? So you actually have to tell it. Tribal Toland. And there we go. It's already off the rails. It's a lot of fun. What is your favorite type of music? Let's see if it has a response. Rock and roll. There you go. I guess a lot of people that trained with this liked rock and roll. Um, so if you get a chance, just do a quick search for AliceBot or Cleverbot, and you'll see the link pop up immediately. play around with them a little bit. It gives you a much better idea of why we don't do generative based models for chatbots. Almost every chatbot you're going to encounter is retrieval based. So with that, I'm going to sign off here, and the very next lecture, we are going to start diving into the code for chatbots and how everything kind of comes together. Y'all have a wonderful night and stay safe. Bye bye.